Good morning. We left off at Exodus 9:12 at the end of the sixth plague. We move on today to the last of the three major groups of plagues, the severe plagues, as they might be called. I know I didn't really give you a chart. I talked about that. Maybe it was on a handout at one point. We haven't really looked at it that way, but sometimes in the past, I haven't found it all that useful to look at a chart of the plagues. It can be useful if you're going to spend a lot of time on it, but I wanted to just take the plagues one by one, more as we really encounter them in the scriptures, rather than sort of compare and contrast them all. But here we come now to the seventh plague, the plague of hail. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Get up early in the morning, confront Pharaoh, and say to him, 'This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go so that they may worship me, or this time I will send the full force of my plagues against you and against your officials and your people, so you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth.'" Yeah, so we have no reference here of the passage of how much time had gone by. It's reasonable to think that, as I had professors speculate once upon a time, that there was maybe a month in between plagues, maybe not that much time, but the whole force of the plagues may have taken as much as a year to come and go, and we don't really know. It's not that vital for us to know that. But once again, God tells Moses to get up early in the morning, get right to it, and confront Pharaoh. And once again, the purpose of the Exodus is to worship God. And there's this additional warning here, the full force of my plagues. So there's that additional severity that God's been restraining himself, probably in order to show his power in some way. So God often works that way by letting a little thing come, and then a bigger thing, and then a bigger thing, to show us that he is in charge of all of it and can handle all of it. Now, the purpose for leaving Egypt was really what? In a negative sense, to get away from their enslavement. In a positive sense, why were they leaving? To go to a different country, to get to Canaan. Yeah. Now, God doesn't exactly have Moses say this. He says, "Let my people go so they may worship me." Now, getting to Canaan, where God had promised to bring them so they could worship him there, was certainly part of that. But there are some who would say that, is God kind of lying to Pharaoh here? Or having Moses lie to Pharaoh to say worship? Because you might think that what did Pharaoh probably assume worship meant? Go out once for a church service and come back, right? When what the Lord really meant was, they're going to go out and worship me and never come back. And so we have this question that Luther talks about here, which is, what constitutes a lie? First of all, there are dogmatically two kinds of if you want to call it a lie. There is the lie that is for someone's, I'll say for someone's bad, and there is the lie that is for someone's good. So you might withhold some truth in order to afflict someone something, but there is also withholding the truth in order to ease someone's pain in some way. Is withholding part of the truth to ease some pain a wise thing, or is it always wrong? Kind of depends. Certainly lying by using God's name is forbidden in the commandments, correct? Lying under oath is forbidden under the commandments. And lying under oath is forbidden by American law, for example, in a courtroom. But if, let's see, I had a childhood classmate who uh, uh, who got into all kinds of trouble. He got into amazing problems, and because of his own sinfulness, and because he threw caution to the wind way too often, and wanted to use and abuse people and use up his friends as if he could spend their friendship to gain things for his life. In fact, my nickname for him, for a while he was my best friend. I ended up being the one who coined the term the weasel for him, that childhood friend of mine. And but his father, who was a widow and was an overworked newspaper man in my hometown, I've told you too much already, did not want to know all of the things his son got into. He didn't have the time or the energy. He and his wife had had their children very late in life. In fact, they weren't their biological children. They were both adopted. And by the time that my friend was 15, his father was 60. His mother had passed away. And so I didn't always tell his dad what his son, the weasel, had gotten into. Was that my responsibility as his friend, as the child's friend? I didn't think so. My dad didn't think so. And I still don't think so. But I wasn't telling him the whole truth, about what he got into, about how drunk he got and things like that. I didn't think that was my place to go telling his dad those things. And that was partly to ease his dad's life and difficulties. His dad suspected all of those things. He didn't have to know all the details. And there are different examples of that. But the one that we have to remember especially is that we owe nothing at all to the devil. Would you agree with that? Not morally, not otherwise. We don't owe the devil anything, and including the whole truth, as we say in the courtroom today. I don't have to tell the devil every little thing. When I am praying aloud on my bedside every single night, and I get to maybe special frustrations or temptations in my life, I've maybe told you this before. I certainly tell my catechism class this all the time. I stop talking out loud sometimes. Because why should I give the devil ammunition against me? Why do I have to tell the devil, who is probably listening to my prayer, why should I tell him what my deepest struggles are so that he can just use them against me later on? Can God still hear me even if I get quiet? Sure. Does the devil maybe suspect? He can read my blood pressure go up when this or that person is around and things like that, other struggles that we all have. No offense, Brad, but I'm just kidding. The devil doesn't need to know those things, and neither do his servants. Withholding information from an enemy is not a lie. And this goes into areas like tomorrow's email devotion. God commands David to fake out the Philistines by pretending to do one thing and then doing another. Is that a lie? Well, to somebody who wants to split hairs, I suppose a military feint would be a lie. Just as a feint in football, is that a lie? To fake this and do that, to line up for a punt and then not punt, that kind of thing, isn't that a lie? And those athletic lies are in the same category of essentially not needing to tell one's opponent or enemy the whole truth. And besides, what do they teach you first day of practice if you're a defensive back? Don't watch the ball, watch his belt buckle. That's where he's really going to go. All right, enough of my limited Northwestern College football knowledge, but we'll let that go. And finally, is it possible, this is on your sheet about a third of the way down, is it possible to act or present yourself in a way that is not the exact truth and yet not still be lying? And here I turn to an example of Jesus. In Luke 24, in the road to Emmaus, what does Jesus do? He acts as if he was going to go farther down the road. And why was that his intention? No, it was not. But that's his feint or his fake with them. And why does he do that? Well, he does this to give them an opportunity to ask him to stay, to invite them to ask for more conversation. He does it to strengthen what is becoming their firm faith in him. So this business of let my people go so they may worship me is not a lie to Pharaoh. It's not the entire truth. And Pharaoh may simply be misunderstanding God's words. Because God leaves out the forevermore part of the intention is not God's problem. It's Pharaoh's problem. Verse 15. For by now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague that would have wiped you off the earth. What kind of plague would have completely destroyed the Egyptians? We don't have to think very hard. It was just in the news New Year's Eve. Earthquake, a tsunami, whatever. Can you imagine a tsunami in the little Mediterranean Sea? Would have been a problem for everybody. But yeah, any kind of an earthquake, a volcano, whatever it was, it had happened in ancient times. It still happens today. It'll still go on. So sure, he could have, and he sometimes does. But, verse 16, I have raised you up for this very purpose. Now Moses is speaking. Who is he speaking to? It's God speaking through Moses to Pharaoh. So I have raised you, Pharaoh, up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So to show something to Pharaoh is a law purpose, right? And so my name be proclaimed in all the earth is a gospel purpose, correct? Well, also law among the other nations who oppose Israel, but it's also a gospel purpose. So God has both things in mind and wants both things to happen. You still set yourself against my people and will not let them go. Therefore, at this time tomorrow, once again, God gives the precise moment, I will send the worst hailstorm that has ever fallen on Egypt from the day it was founded till now. It's the biggest hailstone you've ever seen. John, you got a baseball there.
Actually looked like a
Hockey puck. What year was that? Do you remember?
2010.
I was thinking of 2010. In my yard, they were just golf ball sized, but across town. But anybody else remember that hailstorm? A lot of us got new roofs because of that. Yeah, the color of my roof changed. My dad used to tell my house by what color the roof was. Now we had to switch. So, and then we painted the house anyway. So, all right. Average rainfall in Egypt is usually between 2 and 4 inches. We laugh because that's like one good storm here, but that's their average annual rainfall. In some areas they get more, of course, but in '94 and in 2018. Storms caused flooding in the Nile Delta and in Egypt in the Red Sea that killed hundreds of people. In fact, in 2018, more than 200 people died in one storm because of the flooding. But hail is rare. Does everybody know what causes, meteorologically speaking, what causes hail? You have to have one particular kind of a storm for hail, right? Yeah, it's got to be a thunderhead where the rain bounces, if I can use that word, up and down in the cloud to freeze and thaw and freeze and thaw and freeze and thaw, and it becomes bigger and bigger until finally it falls, and they're enormous. And if you've ever had to be out in it, it really stings. I had to remain for almost a half an hour in the back of a pickup truck driving through a hailstorm when I was a boy. Because that's how we transported lots of kids in those days, was in the backs of pickup trucks. Most of us kind of pulled our shirts partway up over our heads to to fend for ourselves, but it was nasty. It was hot too. It was very, very hot. Hail is often, isn't it often accompanied by tornadoes and things like that? Oh, nasty, nasty stuff. Give an order now to bring your livestock and everything you have in the field to a place of shelter, because the hail will fall on every person and animal that is not brought in and is still out in the field, and they will die. Now, it's a tremendously violent storm if it's going to kill animals. You know, I've known oxen, and I've known horses, and I've known cows that are pretty tough. But and I've known a lot of people that are really wimpy. But to have hail severe enough that it kills must have been tremendously violent storm. But we also know that hail is often accompanied by other things, winds and flooding and even fire and water spouts and tornadoes and things like that. So this is all speaking through Moses to Pharaoh. Those officials of Pharaoh who feared the word of the Lord hurried to bring their slaves and their livestock inside, but those who ignored the word of the Lord left their slaves and livestock in the field. So subject to their master as to whether they got saved or not. There were some jobs in ancient times that were far worse than we can imagine. And I think the slaves who were just simply out in the field didn't have it as bad as some others. I know that mining was a terrible experience in ancient times. Most miners didn't live through the first year of doing their job. And there were other things. I'll save that for Job. Some of the ancient mining stories and fires and mines and things like that. Because what better way to break up a wall of stone than build a fire and then have the slaves go and throw water on it, causing some amazing explosions that killed people very quickly to get a little bit of gold, you know. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand toward the sky, so that hail will fall all over Egypt, on people and animals and on everything growing in the fields of Egypt." So remember, he's about to kill their crops as well, whatever was left. Earlier we had an indication of that it was the springtime. That's also an indication of how long this took, because in the earlier plagues, when it was still spring, that would have corresponded to the spring a year later when the Passover came. Now it's the later harvest, so you see that we've got time passing here during the plagues. I guess that's the main, I was trying to think of the other ones, but that's the main time reference we have within the plagues, are those two harvests, and then later on, the Passover is coming. When Moses stretched out his staff toward the sky, the Lord sent thunder and hail and lightning flashed down to the ground. So the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. Hail fell and lightning flashed back and forth. It was the worst storm in all the land of Egypt since it had become a nation. Being out in lightning is pretty terrifying. What happened to Luther in the thunderstorm, famously? You remember who he swore to? Saint Anne. Yeah, the mother of the Virgin Mary. That's who Luther swore his oath to. Saint Anne, I will become a monk. And he did it. There is evidence to suggest that Luther was already not happy being a lawyer, or at least a legal student, but he decided to become a monk then and there. Mom used to get furious when my brother and I would go out and lay on the grass to watch the thunderstorms. I'll just leave that there. That poor woman, what she went through. Okay. Throughout Egypt, hail struck everything in the fields, both people and animals. It beat down everything growing in the fields and stripped every tree. So the hail came and came and came. Stripping every tree is quite a statement, too. I mean, we've had hail here that mostly left the trees intact, and the grass doesn't seem to be affected. In fact, the grass kind of likes it because the hail melts here. But that must have been a nasty, nasty storm. Well, the worst ever. And the only place it did not hail was in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were. So the Lord once again stretched out his hand to protect his people over in Goshen. Oh, another thing about this, that there is an implication here, since God says the worst in all of Egypt since it became a nation, that suggests that there were either records or oral traditions in Egypt of storms and other events, that they had some kind of a way to measure that. And that fits with the archaeological records that are in Egypt and some surrounding nations like Sumer and Akkad, where very, very bad storms were recorded. They didn't give them, names like we do and things like that, but they at least recorded the very bad storms and maybe how many people died and things like that. At least in Sumer, that's the kind of detail you'd get. In Egypt, maybe not so much, but there were memories of how bad these things were. And by this time, how old was Egypt? Pretty old, at least 1,000 years. We're in Moses' time, the 18th dynasty of Egypt. So, and I know that dynasties 14, 15, 16, and 17 were just crammed into the years, right before Moses' birth. They were all in basically 1 century and 4 dynasties, but it had gone back quite a ways. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron. "This time I have sinned," he said to them. "The Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Pray to the Lord, for we have had enough thunder and hail. I will let you go, and you don't have to stay any longer." Is this faith? Is this repentance? This is fear. Yeah, that's all it is. Repentance without faith is almost always just fear, working like that. In fact, my note says, no, without faith, even an attempt at repentance is only an act of fear. What is Pharaoh doing? He is, in a way, is he trying to bluff his way out of trouble? To buy time? Yeah. I'll see if God believes me for a moment, this God of the Hebrews. Maybe I can lie to him the way I lie to my own gods, Pharaoh says. He's, I suppose in a positive sense, he's a king trying to end a problem for his people, but his heart isn't in it at all. Moses replied, "When I have gone out of the city, I will spread out my hands in prayer to the Lord. The thunder will stop, and there will be no more hail. So you may know that the earth is the Lord's. But I know that you and your officials still do not fear the Lord God." So God lets him know, I don't buy this. But then Moses did it. The flax and the barley were destroyed, since the barley had headed and the flax was in bloom. The wheat and spelt, however, were not destroyed because they ripen later. So flax, linseed, requires something called retting, which is soaking it for a week or 2 weeks to get the non-fibrous material out of the stem. Linseed is used for a lot of different things. The flax is used for what primarily? Linen. This is family history. Not my I learned it from my family, but not our family. In the 19 teens or 20s, famously, you used to use linseed oil to clean your paintbrushes. You still do, actually. You clean them out in gas or something if you're using oil-based paint. Or in the old days, we used it for lead-based paint. But once your brushes are clean, then you store them in linseed, you suspend them in linseed oil, so that then you just wash the linseed oil off the next day and the brushes are still fresh. Then Moses left Pharaoh and went out of the city. He spread out his hands toward the Lord. The thunder and hail stopped, and the rain no longer poured down on the land. Were any of you there for the outdoor service back in about summer of 2001? Pastor Henning had me do the outdoor service. I'd never even been to one yet, and I was told to do it down at the park. And every time I mentioned the voice of the Lord, it thundered. And Professor Plitzwhite from the college had been my teacher back in my college days. And how did you do that? He came back and wanted to know. It's more humbling than anything else. But the rain no longer poured down. When Pharaoh saw that the rain and hail and thunder had stopped, he sinned again. He and his officials hardened their hearts. Who is hardening Pharaoh's heart now? Pharaoh, hardening his own heart. So Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not let the Israelites go, just as the Lord had said through Moses. Okay. Turn the page. I do have a chart here on the slide. So when we get here now, these are just the first 9 of the 10 plagues, the top 3. Blood, frogs, and gnats. It's mostly a case of, was there warning or not, and could the magicians do it? In the 3 middle plagues, the flies, whatever the disease on the cattle was, murrain, or did we say anthrax, or whatever it might have been. Israel now is beginning to be spared from these things. With the boils, the magicians realize they can't do it. Then they fall completely out of the picture for a while. They're going to come back in the next plague. Now in the last group, hail, locusts, and darkness, the more severe plagues, Israel is once again spared. There is a warning for the next one. There won't be for the 9th one. We'll see that happen. So I guess a chart can have some benefit, but it's also good just to walk through them all. So chapter 10, locusts. Then the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh. Again, he's going to get warned. For I have hardened his heart. So the Lord also worked on hardening his heart. And the hearts of his officials, so that I may perform these miraculous signs of mine among them. That you may tell your children and grandchildren how I dealt harshly with the Egyptians, and how I performed my signs among them, and that you may know that I am the Lord. Sorry about my reading today. So Moses and Aaron, let's go back. That you may tell your children and grandchildren how I dealt harshly. Whose responsibility is it to do the telling in a family? Parents especially, father in particular, especially if we're talking about the Word of God. Does this still apply to us? Does Exodus 10:2 speak to our hearts? It should. It should. So what might be a strategy? This is on your sheet here. You got homework now. What might be a strategy I could use in my household to remind these people of these things? My grandchildren, my children, my spouse, or just me? What might be a strategy I use to tell? I assume that none of you live with your grandchildren. I did live with my grandparents for a little while. But whose responsibility is it to tell your grandchildren if their parents fail for some reason?
Well, isn't it our responsibility even if the parents are doing their job?
Sure.
To sit and talk about Bible stories.
When should we do that? When they're with you. Yeah. It's the simplest answer. Is do that when they're with you. When my atheist grandfather tried to convert me Sunday afternoons all through my childhood, from being a Christian to being a good atheist in his mind, he would take every opportunity to compliment my crayon drawing of dinosaurs, to tell me about where dinosaurs really came from, and to walk us, my brother and me, out into the woods and talk about evolution and talk about the origin of species and things like that. And and if my atheist grandfather could do it to convert us away from being Christians, he wasn't successful. Shouldn't we do it to use the same tactic, I'll say, with our own grandchildren, to talk to them, to at least ask them what they're learning in school and Sunday school, and let them retell the story. My brother is just about to fly back from Alaska, going to visit two of his 2 grandchildren who are on an army base in outside of Anchorage. And he loves to go and find out what they're learning in Sunday school. Let them tell you. And then just help carry the story along, ask them questions. That's the simplest way to do it. And let them show you pictures that they've colored or pictures that they've gotten in class or what have you. I found in my family with my own boys, and I still do it, is when we're gathered together for a meal, or at least most of us are there, before we say the table prayer, we'll read a piece of the catechism, a short piece, but a piece of the catechism. Or if we've gone through the whole catechism, we're 3/4 of the way through right now, we'll stop and then we'll do Bible trivia, which makes one of them terrified, and therefore it's a lot of fun. But usually if there's one who's scared, I'll let him ask the questions, because I have to be able to be on the hot seat too. But can you name, or can we as a group name all of the apostles? Come up with all their names, that kind of thing. Or all of the sons of Jacob, or a little bit tougher for us probably, or something like that. Or what are the events in the life of Jesus, or the life of David, or the life of Abraham, or what have you? Can everybody name a bird that's mentioned in the Bible? Sometimes it can just be fun trivia like that, but sometimes a little bit more intense. And then go back to the catechism after a while. With myself, or with my spouse, to do those things, but also some private study. And what I always tried to do was to be constantly willing to talk about Jesus if there's a question, especially when Kath would come home from her 4 or 5 Bible classes a week. And she would come home and ask, and I would push my chair back and listen and talk about whatever they had talked about in class or something like that. Or we would talk about sermons at home, which is the point of the connect groups that Pastor Eilhoffen has going, to talk about sermons after the fact. It just creates a good habit in the mind, in the family, to do that. But what about myself? To do those things, to do private study, but I find the most benefit not only from reading commentaries, which I do for professional, but also for my own private reading. I like to read a lot of Luther, but also I like to talk to children. I love being able to teach children. Why? Because children keep me grounded in the basics of Scripture. I find that if I don't do anything but talk to adults all day about the Bible, we will often get onto tangents and onto minor or subtle things, which are important to talk about, but it may not come up, the most important points of the Bible. And those things do when you're talking with children, and often with new converts as well. So a delight to be able to talk with them. I envy Pastor Scharf, his main Bible study all year, which he teaches 4 or 5 times a year, 10 weeks each time through, the basics of what we teach at St. Paul's, his Bible basics class. I get to teach 1 or 2 of them each time, so we all get to meet all of our new members, or at least in theory. But it's a great way to stay grounded in the basics. All right. Anybody want to comment there or ask a question?
I was just going to comment that along the same lines, I grew up Catholic and went to 12 years Catholic school, and the only time we studied the Bible, we studied the book of Job as a piece of literature, not necessarily the Word of God. So when I was studying to become a Lutheran, became a Lutheran, whatever, I went to teach the youngest preschool kids I could, because I needed the basics just as much as them, and I needed to remember, to keep it simple.
Right.
Just for that reason,
Yeah. My wife almost broke my hand once when we were at another denomination, and we were invited to go to we were just visiting some relatives, and we were invited to go to their Bible class, and it was the last class in a 10 or 12 week series on the book of Job. And the minister there began by saying, well, we know that Job is a once upon a time fairy tale. And even when she was giving birth to our children, she never crushed my hand that hard under the table. I really thought we were going to have to go to the doctor afterwards. Didn't quite draw blood, but wow, I think she broke something. But she was pretty upset. And we had agreed ahead of time we wouldn't, we were invited, and I wasn't there to take over the class or anything. If I would have been asked a question, I would have answered it, but I wasn't there to contradict everything that minister said, although I was tempted to. One thing that happened there was a little old lady in her 90s, I think, who after the class said, "Oh, Pastor, I'm so glad to have gone to this class. I grew up my whole life believing that all of the Bible, the book of Job and all the Gospels were absolutely true. And now you've taught me otherwise. I'm so glad." That broke my heart. I'm just going to let that sit there. Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said to him, this is chapter 10, verse 3, "This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. How long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will bring locusts into your country tomorrow." So again, the time frame is set by the Lord. Some time has come and gone, and after the hail is cleared up and everything, and maybe there was grass growing again. I don't know if the trees had budded out again yet or not, but things must have looked pretty ratty there in Egypt by this time. And now another threat. Once again, though, "Let my people go so they may worship me." There's no more talk about 3 days. "They will cover the face of the ground," this is the locusts, "so that it cannot be seen. They will devour what little you have left after the hail, including every tree that is growing in your fields. They will fill your houses and those of all your officials and all the Egyptians, something neither your fathers nor your forefathers have ever seen from the day they settled in this land till now." Then Moses turned and left Pharaoh. What is a locust? It is a grasshopper. What I've learned is that what distinguishes a locust from a grasshopper is simply the weather when they were maturing. And I forget, Paul, do you know this? It's if there is a especially hot, wet spring, I think it is. It's weather dependent, and it does something to the chemical makeup of the grasshoppers. And they grow wings, and they become gregarious. They begin to gather together to go as a swarm, rather than go off on their own. Otherwise, grasshoppers by themselves are, they don't really join together in mobs, but locusts do. Now, Luther mentions that these critters in Hebrew are bay, that they don't have them in Germany, Luther says. And he says, but we do have caterpillars that come and wreck the crops. And we know that they're worse some years than they are other years. And so he permits his people to think of this as caterpillars rather than probably grasshoppers or locusts as we do. Is there anything wrong with that? He's just applying the text to his people, and that's something that they could understand. It's not vital that we think of locusts as locusts to understand the story. It's vital to understand that these were bugs that God brought in that ate all the crops, or ate whatever was left of what they had. So I don't really have a problem with that. And reading manuals on Bible translation, as I've begun to do ever since 2014, that's 10 years, is that you have to think of what's called the receptor language. Will the people in that country who speak this language, will they understand what the Bible means if I put it this way or this way? So once in a while you have to, once in a while you may have to soften a word. Like rather than a specific bird, you might have to say What's acceptable as the other offering. For, in some languages, you might have to say a big songbird. If they don't have doves or pigeons there or something like that. Would that be okay? Yeah, he's not specific. Something like that. Yeah. Pharaoh's officials said to him, "How long will this man be a snare to us? Let the people go so they may worship the Lord their God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined?" Then Moses and Aaron were brought back to Pharaoh. "Go worship the Lord your God," he said, "but just who will be going?" So Pharaoh wants to know. And Moses answered, "We will go with our young and our old, and with our sons and daughters, and with our flocks and herds, because we are to celebrate a festival to the Lord." So what's Moses answered? We're all going. There won't be a dog left in Egypt that belonged to us. Pharaoh said, "The Lord be with you if I let you go." By the way, that's a curse or an oath here. The Lord be with you. It's probably softened. We would think of God blank you with a different verb there, wouldn't we? But that's basically in his dialect what he's doing there, right? So not so much be with you as damn you, I think, is the way Pharaoh's speaking. Pharaoh said, "If I let you go along with your women and children, clearly you are bent on evil. No, have only the men go and worship the Lord, since that's what you have been asking for." Then Moses and Aaron were driven out of Pharaoh's presence, and the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over Egypt, so that locusts will swarm over the land and devour everything growing in the fields, everything left by the hail." So here they come. Moses stretched out his staff over Egypt, and the Lord made an east wind blow across the land all that day and all that night. What is east of Egypt? The whole Arabian Peninsula across the Red Sea there. So there's a lot of land there and a lot of places where locusts might come from, whether it was Sinai or whether it was from over in somewhere in Arabia or Yemen or something like that, whatever it was. But by morning the wind had brought the locusts. They invaded all Egypt and settled down in every area of the country in great numbers. Never before had there been such a plague of locusts, nor will there be ever again. Remember in Minnesota, how long did the locust plague last? 3 years? Yeah, and it was worse here in Egypt. They covered all the ground until it was black. They devoured all that was left after the hail, everything growing in the fields and the fruit on the trees. Nothing green remained on tree or plant in all the land of Egypt. And of course, grasshoppers will then begin to eat anything else. Linen clothing, which is made of flax, papyrus, and therefore all Egyptian records would suddenly be, all of their books and scrolls would now be food. All of their decorations that were, paintings and things like that. Harnesses. Any decoration you might have in your hair. Can you imagine? Just everything would have been food for those things. Pharaoh quickly summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Now forgive my sin once more and pray to the Lord your God and take this deadly plague away from me." Moses, and again, he's just trying to bluff his way into making the thing end. Moses then left Pharaoh and prayed to the Lord, and the Lord changed the wind to a very strong west wind, which caught up the locusts and carried them into the Red Sea. Not a locust was left anywhere in Egypt. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go. You've been listening to Invisible Church, the Bible study podcast from St. Paul's Lutheran Church, New Ulm, Minnesota.